should be capital expenses.
That's what it's on my board.
Or is it,
It doesn't go into the ground.
no, is it like a sonar thing that
Council and committee meeting to order. Before we proceed, I want to acknowledge that we begin this meeting by acknowledging that the land upon which we are gathered is the traditional territory of the Adirondack, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe people. We are the beneficiaries of ancient agreements such as the dish with one spoon between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, who agreed to share the abundance of the land through peace, friendship, and mutual respect. The two-row wampum, by which the Haudenosaunee welcomed the settlers and agreed to share the land in mutual respect, and the Treaty of Niagara, considered a fundamental document by First Nations in all future relations and treaties with the British. We recognize that we have a responsibility to be stewards of the land in cooperation and collaboration with the Indigenous peoples, not only for one generation, but for all generations to come. We understand that we have an obligation to learn the lessons of our history, educate ourselves about the experiences of the Indigenous people, and seek opportunities to heal the wounds that will result in reconciliation with our Indigenous sisters and brothers. Many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people live and work in Fort Erie. We stand with all Indigenous people, past and present, in promoting the wise stewardship of the lands on which we live. We have the good fortune to live in a land of abundance, diversity, and beauty. Let us be vigilant in protecting Turtle Island. Madam Clerk, the roll call.
All members of council are present. Mayor Redekop.
I have some brief announcements this evening. And the first relates to the Sugar Bowl Stormwater Management Pond. That large pond in the Sugar Bowl is a functioning stormwater management pond. Over the years, it has been inadequately maintained, resulting in an accumulation of excessive vegetation around its banks and into the pond, garbage disposed of by inconsiderate individuals, and the creation of natural wildlife habitat. Recently, the town contracted for the pond to be dredged and cleaned up in order to return the pond to its original functional purpose. The contractor hired someone to remove and relocate wildlife, frogs, turtles, snakes, and fish prior to the commencement of the work. While this was done, unfortunately not all of the wildlife was captured and relocated. This week it was brought to our attention that a number of small turtles and frogs remained on site in their habitat that had now been destroyed as a result of the reconstruction work. I wish to thank all of the individuals who took it upon themselves to rescue these small amphibians and reptiles on their own initiative. And Councillor McDermott, I want to acknowledge that you've been on this from, I guess, the beginning of, actually prior to the construction work, because you had inquiries, as did I. On Friday, staff and I spoke with environmentalists concerned about the situation and arranged for collaboration in removing and relocating remaining wildlife pending completion of the landscaping around the pond. I've also spoken to staff about the need to revise and update our stormwater management pond regulations and maintenance standards to ensure that all ponds are constructed to meet council's expectations, taking into consideration suggestions made recently by our local environmental advisory committee, and that they be monitored and maintained on a schedule that will prevent in the future the large-scale disruption that took place in the Sugar Bowl. Council and our environmental community will be engaged in this process along with town staff. Second item has to do with Fort Erie Sting Soccer Club or Football Club. Yesterday evening they played a team from Scarborough in the quarterfinals of the Ontario Cup. They fell behind in the first half 1-0. In the second half, each team scored a goal, but then Scarborough netted a third, putting the game out of reach, and the final score was 3-1. Despite losing in the Ontario Cup quarterfinal, the Sting played excellent, exciting, and inspired football in front of a large crowd for a local game. They've become excellent role models and mentors for the hundreds of local youth now engaged in soccer in our community. We wish them and the greater Fort Erie Youth Soccer all the best in the future. And then with respect to the upcoming Association of Municipalities of Ontario conference, members of council will be attending this year's annual AMO conference in London next week. We're scheduled to meet with the Ministers of Infrastructure and Economic Development and the Parliamentary Assistant to the Minister of Finance. We will be discussing issues of major importance to the town relative to servicing lands to facilitate manufacturing and industrial growth, highlighting the attractive location of Fort Erie for businesses that export products, providing affordable housing for residents and the anticipated influx of post-secondary students, supporting the horse racing industry, and promoting the entertainment zoned areas in town. We're also trying to arrange a meeting with the Minister of Health to continue our recent discussions regarding Fort Erie's primary, urgent, and secondary healthcare needs. That conference runs from Sunday, August the 20th to Wednesday, August the 23rd. And then finally, this is the 20th anniversary of the major electricity blackout in the northeastern United States and in Ontario and Quebec. And that in itself was a once-in-a-lifetime event. But for those engaged in local affairs, it was also the date when the plane piloted by Tony Schertzing, a Piper Cherokee, crashed in Iroquois near Brockville on August the 14th. And Tony and Jane Schertzing and Mike Anderson, Councillor for Ward 2, were all killed in that unfortunate plane crash. And fortunately, the Schertzing's daughter, Tara, who was 24 years of age at the time, did survive. They were all on a trip. They'd gone to the area for an annual celebration with respect to the trucking industry, of which they were involved as the owners, and Mike was the manager of the Truck and Travel Center at the time. Mike Anderson had a long history in Fort Erie. He was 55 years of age at the time, and his funeral was held at the Leisureplex. There were over 600 people that attended. I was honored to provide one of the eulogies, and during my comments I mentioned that Mike was a dedicated family man, a trusted and reliable employee, an outstanding public servant, a good friend, and a remarkable, generous individual. Well prior to his engagement in politics, he was very active with the Kinsmen in Fort Erie, a variety of other nonprofit activities. He sat beside me here, provided sage advice many times. So, Councillor Flagg, you're stepping into those large shoes. Councillor Dubanow, you're representing the ward that he did represent, and that plane crash occurred just a few months before the 2003 election. I have no doubt he would have been reelected quite handily, and he was a very stable and reasoned voice on council. I want to extend our best wishes to his wife, Angie, and his two children, Chris and Lisa. I know that he would have been very, very excited to have grandchildren. Lisa has children. And it was terribly unfortunate. He casts a long shadow, and I don't think there's a day that goes by that Angie, Chris, and Lisa don't think of him. And I can tell you that I think of him frequently because he was a wonderful individual. Those are the announcements. Sorry to end on such a somber note. Are there any declarations of pecuniary interest? If not, then we have a series of upcoming public meetings and open houses. The first one on August 15th, which is tomorrow, relative to a proposed zoning bylaw amendment and draft plan of subdivision. That's an open house, which will be held here at Town Hall in the atrium starting at 5 p.m. There's another open house on August the 17th with respect to the 2023 housekeeping amendment of the town's comprehensive zoning bylaw. And then there's a public meeting, two public meetings on August the 28th. The first deals with a proposed zoning bylaw amendment and draft plan of subdivision for property on Walden Boulevard. That meeting will commence at 6 p.m. The information report regarding that public meeting will be available on the town's website on Thursday, August the 24th. Same with respect to a proposed zoning bylaw amendment for 3701 Elm Street. Again, in the council chambers, August the 28th, and the information report available on our website, 5 p.m. on August the 24th. That takes us to tonight's public meeting, which relates to the proposed community benefits charge. and Special Advisor for Planning and Development Services, Alex Hurlovich, will be providing us some background. Are you going to be going down to the podium, Mr. Hurlovich?
To your worship, we have Jackie Hall from Hampson Consulting. She'll be making a presentation, and then I could speak to the planning report, which has 5 recommendations that council move forward with that
Right.
particular strategy.
Okay, and so Ms. Hull will be zooming in, I presume?
Jackie Hall is in the Zoom meeting. I'll move her in now.
Please bring her in, thank you. I should mention while we're waiting that this will be a public meeting that will permit council to hear from Ms. Hull and eventually our special advisor on planning matters. Members of council can ask questions. I'll then be asking if there's anyone who wishes to speak in support of the recommendations or opposed to the recommendations, and then I'll ask the clerk if we've received any comments. I'll also ask if there's anyone in the digital waiting room who might wish to weigh in as well. So with that, Ms. Hull, good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of council. It's a pleasure to be here this evening, and thank you so much for the introduction. I do hope that this presentation will be relatively short and concise and to the point. As was mentioned at the introduction, the purpose of today's meeting is to hold the opportunity for the public to make comment on the community benefits strategy and associated bylaw, which was made publicly available in advance of the meeting today. And what I'd like to do over the next 15 minutes or so is talk about what community benefits charges are, what they're proposed to be used for in the town, and how the strategy and bylaw will be implemented going forward. And of course, at the end, provide opportunity for questions as you noted. So just getting right into it, what are community benefits charges? It's a new regime that has been introduced in Ontario. Essentially what it's intended to do is replace what we used to call Section 37 or heightened density bonusing under the Planning Act. The idea being is that process was not as transparent as the development industry wanted it to be. And as a result of legislative changes, we've now arrived at a new revenue source for municipalities in Ontario, referred to as community benefits charges. They are quite distinct from DCs, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well, just to provide that context. But essentially how this works is that the charges are imposed by a bylaw. There aren't any more individual agreements, which used to happen under the old Section 37 regime. Only local municipalities can levy this charge. So upper tier municipalities are not able to collect or charge community benefits charges. It requires what the legislation refers to as a strategy. For those of you who have seen the strategy, it's somewhat similar to how we structure our development charges background studies, in that it talks about all the supporting information in order to substantiate the charge that we've laid forward, and also talks a little bit about the legislative requirements. It's also important to note that in-kind contributions are permitted, and that there is an opportunity to provide credits for those contributions. CBCs are a limited revenue raising tool for a few different reasons. The one being is that it can only be charged on developments that have 5 or more stories and also have 10 or more residential units. So they have to meet both of those qualifiers. The regulations that have been brought forward as part of the legislation says that the CBCs, or amount of CBCs that you can charge per individual development, is effectively capped. And that's capped at 4% of the land value. And it's intended to reflect the value of the land the day before the first building permit is issued. That's just really a way of saying that it would reflect all of the zoning permissions on the site at that time, because as additional density is permitted on land, the value of land typically tends to go up. And so just talking a little bit about the implementation and administration, recognizing this is a new revenue source. In order for us to adopt a bylaw, we do have to have consultation, which is what we're undertaking this evening. However, it's not defined. Under the Development Charges Act, for example, we have a very specific approach to consultation that we must take. However, through this process, it simply says that we are required to do it, but there isn't necessarily a required way in which to go about doing it. The way that most municipalities do undertake consultation is by simply having a statutory or a public meeting like we're doing this evening. Interestingly, only one CBC bylaw is allowed. That doesn't necessarily preclude us from introducing different sorts of discounts and exemptions in certain areas. However, unlike the Development Charges Act, where we can have multiple bylaws, we can only have one community benefits charges bylaw. We do have to provide a notice of passage of the bylaw and allow individuals, if they so choose, there is the right to appeal to the Ontario Land Tribunal. In terms of the administration and reporting side of things, we have to establish a CBC special account. It's essentially a reserve fund in which all the money that is collected is then identified and put into that specific reserve. In a calendar year, a municipality shall spend or allocate at least 60% of the money. So essentially it's saying any of the revenues that we're collecting, we're earmarking it or spending 60% of that within a year. We have to maintain a list of at least 3 appraisers under agreement with the municipality. This relates back to the rules around if there are disputes of what that 4% of the land value is. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. And then there's also a requirement to produce an annual report showing the opening and closing balances of the special account and all transactions. This is very similar to what the town already does as part of the DC development charges regime. And so many of our clients that we've worked with who have established CBCs are just simply integrating the CBC reporting in with the DC reporting as well. The schematic on the screen provides an overview of what is required in order to substantiate the calculation and how we essentially arrive at the determination of what the CBCs are. So in order to identify CBC eligible development, we do complete a growth forecast where we look at the amount, type, and location of development that meets those qualifiers of 5 or more stories and 10 or more residential units. We then create a capital program that identifies the different projects and capital needs that are related to servicing that type of development. Similar to the development charges regime, we do have to make several reductions for things such as any sort of anticipated grants, contributions. If there are other development charges or sources that would also contribute to a project, we have to reduce that as well. And if there's any sort of benefit that would be provided to the existing residents, or if there was a repair or replacement component of these projects, that would be deducted as well, recognizing that this is intended to fund growth-related infrastructure. That's a fancy way of basically just saying it's related to infrastructure that is needed to service future development. After we make all those adjustments, we come up with our costs that are eligible for CBC recovery. And we make sure that there's that nexus between the costs themselves and the eligible development. So once again, the 5 or more stories or 10 or more residential units. As I said, CBCs can fund any growth-related capital costs, which is quite nice that it has that flexibility. So we can certainly overlap with services that are identified for funding through development charges and parkland dedication. However, we cannot double count projects. So we can't be collecting for the same project in the development charge bylaw as we are in the community charges benefits bylaw. However, we are able to fund different shares of those projects between the two. For the purposes of Fort Erie CBC strategy, we are looking at several services that we've grouped together. We have CBC bylaw reviews and strategy updates. So there's costs in there associated with appraisals. The update of the bylaw, the legislation does require that we do a refresh, which is simply examining if the bylaw needs to be updated every 5 years or not. Public realm and urban amenities, that includes essentially infrastructure related to the public realm, as well as trails and parkland development. We have active transportation, which of course includes our bike infrastructure, affordable housing, parking, and administration and studies. Those last three are identified with an asterisk as they are no longer eligible to be funded from development charges. So we've maximized whatever we can recover through the CBCs as part of the strategy. As I mentioned, there still is that requirement to have that nexus between the servicing needs that we've identified or the capital infrastructure and the development that is occurring. So the capital costs that we include in the strategy has to be related to the servicing needs with those buildings that meet the qualifier for a CBC. So 5 or more stories and 10 or more residential units. I'll also note that the CBC legislation is much more flexible than the development charges in that we aren't necessarily required to split the funding evenly between all of these services or service groupings that I show in the slide. There is quite a bit of flexibility in that if council decides I want to attribute all of our CBC monies to affordable housing, that can happen through that annual statement where we have to at least spend or allocate 60% of the reserve funds. Many of our clients, what they do is they come out with an implementation strategy after the CBC is passed. It simply says, for the purposes of this update, as they're going through their budgeting process, we are prioritizing funding for active transportation initiatives, for affordable housing initiatives, and you have that flexibility to attribute the funds that way. The development charges are much more regimented, where we have separate reserves for all the different services, and therefore we can only spend library funds on libraries. But here the CBC is a bit more flexible than that, which is a good thing. And it's particularly a good thing because it is quite a limited revenue tool, which I'll talk about in a few slides. But just quickly on the development forecast, as some of the numbers in the study might be different than what Town Council has seen historically. The reason being is that we have looked at our development forecast based on the recent municipal comprehensive review, which was completed by Niagara Region. We've also worked with staff to look at the recent development applications as well. And so for the purposes of our strategy, we are looking at a 10-year planning horizon, that being 2023 to 2032. And what we've identified is that about 450 units will be eligible to pay CBCs over the planning horizon. Realistically, that number could be a little bit less, it could be a little bit more, but once we have the CBC bylaw in place, if they hit that threshold, then they pay the CBCs. The growth-related capital program, so in total, we have about $54 million identified in net costs related to those service groupings I talked about a few slides ago. So that includes the updating of the CBC strategy and bylaw, public realm and urban amenities, active transportation, housing, parking, and administration. The largest component being active transportation. There is a fair amount of non-growth related shares, which relates to updating existing infrastructure. And so essentially what this is showing you on the slide is that the net cost of the $54 million for all of our services, after we make all those adjustments that I talked about, ineligible shares, potential funding from other revenue sources, and making sure that we create that nexus between shares of projects that actually benefit CBC eligible developments, it ends up only being about $3.4 million that is eligible for CBC funding over the planning period. I know that that's quite a shocking change or number in terms of comparing the total cost of the program to what's actually eligible to be funded, but this is consistent with what we see in other municipalities as well, that relationship. It's really bringing it back to the fact that right now, Fort Erie is beginning to see higher levels of intensification. We're really in the next 10 years going to start to see that uptick in that type of development. And so therefore, the majority of growth occurring in Fort Erie isn't necessarily going to be paying a CBC. However, it's important that that revenue tool get put into place because once it does, the bylaw actually never expires either. We just have to do that refresh every 5 years, which is a good thing. I should also note that our firm has been retained to assist the town with the update of the 2024 development charges background study. So as part of that process, we will also be looking at the capital program that we're bringing forward and just making sure that we're not having any of those issues with the double counting between the revenue sources, like I talked about earlier on in the presentation. As for how we structure the CBC, the legislation, once again, is quite flexible. So it could differentiate charges based on certain areas within the town. It could be different types of built form in terms of meeting those density requirements. It could be bands of charges. However, regardless of how we structure it, the legislation says that the CBC or community benefits charges cannot exceed 4% of the land value. There's also there were some minor changes made to the CBC legislation back in November of 2022. And essentially that just means that we're making adjustments for if there's any sort of buildings that are retained on the existing land, and there's a formula to do that. But it's important that I note that nonetheless. And if there is a disagreement as to what that 4% of the land value is, there are rules, very specific rules that are set out in the legislation as to what to do when there is a disagreement. And that is also set out in the strategy as well. So for the purposes of the town CBC bylaw, we are recommending that the rate be set at 4% of the land value. I'll talk about this in another slide, but that is the most common approach to structuring these charges. Effectively, we've already demonstrated that the town is not going to offend that 4% cap with the capital program that we're bringing forward. And so what we've done is we've identified some potential CBC revenues, assuming that 4% cap, and we've looked at land values within the town and within neighboring municipalities, just to give us a sense of what we can really expect. So in the low range over the 10-year planning horizon, we're looking at just shy of $500,000 in CBC revenue. On the higher end of that, it's closer to $900,000. Averaging out those two numbers, it's about $670,000 over the 10-year period. And once again, this is dependent on a host of different factors in terms of those number of units that will actually qualify for that development. We know that things are changing quite rapidly in the context of planning in Ontario right now. The need to build higher density developments as well. We could see an uptick in that number. Therefore, we could see that revenue potentially increase as well. As I mentioned, just again, justifying why we would go forward with a 4% cap of land value as the CBC rate is that our forecast revenue on the low end is about $673,000. Our CBC eligible share of the program is about $4 million. And so once again, we're not offending that 4%. So therefore, that's how we've justified using that as our rate structure. As I mentioned earlier, the majority of municipalities that have CBCs have introduced a rate that is based on 4% of the land value. So that applies to each individual development. There are a few municipalities which have done a per unit charge. That includes the town of Innisfil and the city of Pickering. I would note that the town of Innisfil CBC is under appeal right now, so not sure if that will proceed forward once that appeal is done or not. But the 4% of the land value does align with what your neighbor in the city of Niagara Falls is doing as well. And you can see that we have just an average amount of revenue per unit. So that would be about $1,500 in Fort Erie compared to some other places in the GTA. Niagara Falls, we look at an average of about $1,800 per unit based on their land values. And so it does vary by area quite dramatically, but once again, it's because it's just tied to what the value of the land is in that particular jurisdiction. Just to wrap up in terms of where we're at in the process and where we will be going over the next few weeks, the CBC strategy and bylaw were made available at the end of June. We are now holding the public meeting today on August 16th or August 14th, my apologies. Any comments we will consider prior to the approval of the bylaw. We have not received anything to date. And so we are hoping to pass the bylaw at the end of this month at the next council meeting on August 28th. So with that, that concludes the formal presentation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hall. Do any members of council have any questions? Ms. Hall, I wonder if you could go to slide 6. So this indicates then if out of the $4 million eligible, maybe $14,000 could be collected for affordable housing?
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor. That is the way in which that the program has been structured in terms of what has been identified as the eligible share. However, as I mentioned, the CDC strategy is quite flexible, and how we actually apply that funding can actually exceed that in the future, so long as the affordable housing component is growth related and we meet that nexus test of attributing the shares of projects that are related to that higher density development. The affordable housing program that we developed as part of the strategy, we did note that it is a preliminary estimate. As we know, the town is doing some really great work right now in order to determine how those initiatives should move forward. Really what we wanted to do was make sure it was identified as a potential service, so there was that flexibility to fund it in the future.
So I may not be understanding entirely what's going on that graph, that chart, but it looks like active transportation has a much greater priority than affordable housing, according to this chart.
Yes, so through you, Mr. Mayor, the way in which that this chart is shown is the current capital program that we have developed for the purposes of the CBC strategy. And we've identified, based on those projects as they stand today, their applicable CBC eligible shares. However, we recognize that the program will change in the future, particularly affordable housing being the example again. We know that there is ongoing work and that the potential funding of those projects might increase in the future. And so as a result, this isn't intended to be, this doesn't necessarily have to dictate the way in which you actually attribute those funds to those different types of projects. The Development Charges Act, for example, we would have an active transportation rate, and that could only be used to fund active transportation. The CBCs are much more flexible in that we simply collect 4% of the land value. And then as long as we have a growth-related project associated with these services, and it is related to servicing higher density, we can fund those shares of those projects.
I guess my concern would be that what this graphic says maybe isn't what will eventually occur, but the affordable housing challenge in Fort Erie, and I'd like your comment on this, from my perspective, has been exacerbated by the growth that has taken place. That is, people have moved in here from outside of Fort Erie, they've expanded the population, they've distorted the market, and they've created a bit of a housing crisis locally. And that may not be traditionally viewed as growth related, but there's no doubt that without the growth, that distortion wouldn't have taken place, hence our concern about the affordability of housing.
Yes, that's a great comment, Mr. Mayor. And so just to help maybe shed some additional light on some of the other things that are happening with the growth-related revenue tools in Ontario right now, under the Development Charges Act and the Planning Act, there has been legislation passed to provide exemptions for affordable and attainable housing. However, the definitions of those housing types have not yet been established. The whole principle behind them is that it would help to incent the construction of affordable and attainable housing in Ontario. We have been made aware that there are working groups being struck by the province right now to help work out those definitions. So we anticipate that that's something that will likely come forward, potentially even as early as in the fall. And once again, what we're likely going to see as a result of those provincial initiatives coming forward is that action or capital projects implemented by municipalities at the local level might then shift or need to change in response to that. I'm not sure if that helps to answer your question, but I can certainly work with staff to come back and provide some further explanation as to how the implementation of this program can be done going forward.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I guess my concern is that if I were going to be crafting a policy with respect to affordable and or attainable housing, I would start with the definition. And this seems to be all backwards, not your fault. What's coming out of Toronto seems to be somewhat backwards and it's problematic. Could you go to slide 10, please? And so we and many of the other comparators are using 4% of the land value. And as a result of your studies, I presume that that's a preferable approach to take as opposed to the examples set out by Innisfil and Pickering where they're going by a unit, a charge.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, once again, a very good question. So with respect to the 4% of land value, we have found that it is the best approach to use for a few different reasons. One being, if we try to go down the approach of creating a per unit charge, you end up essentially identifying developments that will be understated in terms of their amount of CPCs that they owe because they might not hit that 4% of land value. Or alternatively, you'll have developments which have much more higher density permissions, and therefore a per unit rate might not be enough for them to hit the 4% of the land value. And so then you're undercharging them. So the most fair approach that we found, and the majority of the industry, they haven't appealed the rate structures themselves in terms of the 4% of the land value, because that's simply what the legislation allows you to do in terms of a maximum. If by chance they feel that their individual development has paid too much, there are rules very clearly set out in the legislation in terms of what will happen if there's a dispute. Their appraisal will be brought forward, and then there will be consideration given by both parties as to if it's been reasonable or not. If their valuation is more reasonable, or if they don't agree with what they've paid, then they are refunded, and then the 4% of land value is upheld based on those rules.
And with a unit amount that's static, whereas the 4% of land value will continue to shift as the value of the land goes up, we would be able to collect more money. I got it. Any other councillors? Councillor Noyes?
Thank you, Mayor Redekop. My question is in regards to the appraisers, that we need 3 appraisers in agreement. How do we go about appointing them? Like, is there like a government list to say these are approved appraisers and you can pick 3? Or I'm not sure if the appraiser is a protected title or not, or if there's specific credentials that we have to be looking for.
Ms. Hall?
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor. There are, the requirements are set out in the legislation, and essentially it just says that the municipality must have a list of 3 appraisers. We do recommend that that list get implemented shortly after the bylaws passed, before the first application is received or the first CPC monies are collected. And that's something, I don't believe that they are identified legislatively in terms of which appraisers you have to use. However, I do think they have to be registered under, there's a certain piece of legislation that they must be registered under, and we can work with staff in order to identify appraisers that would be reasonable. We actually completed the City of Niagara Falls CBC strategy, so we can also reach out to them and see who they've been using and who's under their agreement with them.
Thank you, that's all.
Any other members of council? If not, thank you very much, Ms. Hall. We appreciate the information that you've provided to us. Is there anyone who wishes to speak in favor of the community benefits charges report? If not, Mr. Patton, could you check to see if there's anybody in the digital waiting room? Okay, is there anyone who wishes here to speak in opposition to the proposed community benefit charge? And I take it there's no one else in the digital waiting room now, Mr. Patton. Okay, is there anyone here who wishes to ask any questions about community benefits? Mr. Kidd, you being the only eager resident of Fort Erie here, if you haven't raised your hand, I'm going to assume that you're here to observe. So, Madam Clerk, have we received any communication relative to this issue that needs to be referred to on the record?
Nothing additional has been received, Mayor Redekop.
Okay, then I'm going to close this public meeting, and I'm going to look for a mover for report PDS 53, 2023. Councillor Dubanow. That report is on the floor for any questions or comments. This is a particularly uninquisitive group this evening. Councillor Dubanow.
Yeah, just a quick comment, Your Worship. We had an opportunity to discuss this framework and the report and the consultant's work at our last Planning and Development Services meeting, and the comment is more just in the wider scope of some of the changes being proposed by the province. When you look at the small amount of money and the very strict criteria with which this applies, which in a municipality like ours, we don't have 70-story buildings being proposed in areas where we typically see 30. We're talking, mid-rise, and even walk-ups like 3, 4, 5 floors. The chance to actually be able to utilize this is very limited for us. And even going forward in the 10-year planning horizon, I still can't think of, a lot of opportunity to utilize a framework like this. It strikes me that this was, crafted for Toronto, the outside of Toronto again. And it really doesn't really seem to capture the challenges that, kind of the exurban areas surrounding Toronto, but not within the GTA itself, is facing right now with the development pressures and community benefits. And, DCs are a whole other matter, but, we'll have an opportunity soon to go down that road. So I'm a little frustrated. I look at the very small amount of revenue. I look at, our forecasts for growth-related, expenses, especially affordable housing. We've been able to use Section 37 benefits in the past very successfully to, obtain funding for our affordable housing reserves. We're going to lose out on, that flexibility. So, I'm going to approve it. We really don't have a choice. Our hand has been forced by higher levels of government, perhaps well-intentioned, but perhaps not looking at the greater context of, what exists on this side of the Burlington Skyway. So I hope as we have, continue to have conversations that, we have more opportunity on the affordable housing front going forward. I was a little encouraged to hear some of that. We just got to hold their feet to the fire and ensure that they actually go through with it. So that's all I had to say, Your Worship. I'm sure it's a concern many municipalities in Ontario that are not Toronto or the Toronto sphere of influence, if you will, are facing right now. So thank you very much, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Dubanow. Councillor Noyes.
Thank you, Mayor Redekop. How does this affect, or does it affect, those site plans that have already been approved but not yet built?
Mr. Hurlovich?
Yes, Your Worship. Through you to the councillor, the monies would be collected at the time of the building permit issuance. So they could have a site plan in approval now, and when they come for the building permit, if they're over 5 stories and greater than 10 units, they would be charged the 4%.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Christensen, you had your hand up?
Yes, through you, Your Worship. And building on Councillor Dubanow's comments, and this is simply a comment, I also, I guess it's not just the Toronto centrism, the fact that it's based, that the premise is based on land value, and on, as Councillor Dubanow pointed out, the number of units that are actually eligible for CBCs. It appears to me that this is, and actually the fact that the infrastructure that would be paid for by these charges is going to cost the same to implement anywhere in the province, and possibly more in certain more isolated parts of the province. It simply reinforces inequities in available infrastructure services and across the province. So I just want to bring that. It often isn't brought forward, but the application of this type of land value-based assessment to everywhere in the province when, yes, Toronto, Richmond Hill, whatever, as the chart shows, is the assessment is significantly higher. So they're getting more contribution toward stuff that'll cost the same, whether it's here or Thunder Bay or Timmins or anywhere else in Niagara. Really concerns me. It's a policy flaw that I think needs to be spoken to, and hopefully is something that we can bring forward over time, because it affects not only the items here, but the philosophy that's used is affecting a wide range of services that should be available by virtue of taxpayers paying into the system across the province. So it's an inequity that I think needs to be raised. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Christensen. Mr. Hurlovich, maybe you or Mr. Jansen, have we heard anything recently from the province about making us and the other municipalities in Ontario whole as a result of the DC charge changes? I'll go to Mr. Hurlovich first. Have you heard anything?
Yeah, Your Worship, I have no information on that.
Mr. Jansen?
Other than what the province released, I think, in the last couple of weeks regarding audits of 5 or 6 larger municipalities and their intentions related to that, no, I'm not aware of any other update.
And have we been asked to provide an audit yet?
Thankfully, no.
Okay. And Mr. Hurlovich, so is this money that we would expect to generate from the community benefits charges, would that be similar to the amount that we would lose as a result of the changes in what we can charge for development charges?
Yeah, I haven't looked at that particular calculation, so I can't say one way or the other.
Okay, I wonder if you maybe could ask Ms. Hall to consider that and then maybe provide us with an answer.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? If not, then I'm going to call the question on the report. All those in favor of the recommendations? None opposed. That is carried. That then takes us to the consent agenda. Can I have a mover for that? Councillor McDermott. Those reports are on the floor. Are there any questions or comments? Councillor Noyes.
Yes, my first one is the CAO-17 2023 funding request for Dr. Singh. And I just wanted to welcome her to our municipality. Now, was it her request for $75,000, or I thought in the past we gave $100,000?
I don't know, Mr. Jansen, are you able to comment on that? I know that this is a $15,000 per year times 5 years service. It had been 75. The policy provides up to 100, but this is an amount that was discussed and agreed upon. Do you have any further information, Mr. Jansen?
No, I do not. I can certainly follow up with Alice and find out the nature of that request, which would have been done in accordance with the guidelines we have established by council. Right. So, no, I'm not sure why.
Anything further, Councillor Noyes?
Yes, thank you for that. But I also wanted to talk about CAO 18 2023 funding request for clinic equipment to the Fort Erie Group Family Practice. I am not in favor of this. I think what they're asking for, when you're talking about stools and you're talking about scales, we're talking about basic equipment that every doctor's office has to have. I don't think we want to start getting into providing basic equipment for operational needs. I don't think that's what physician recruiting is all about. I know it's not a huge amount, but I think it sets precedents. Again, what's the next ask? So we should start waiving the taxes, we should start paying their hydro bill. Like, I think the equipment that they're asking for is basic equipment that every doctor and every office has, and I don't want to start replacing it. Again, I don't know, we don't even know who's getting it. We don't know if this new doctor's getting it. We don't know what happened to Dr. Leung's equipment. And for those who haven't been on council before, this town has been extremely generous in paying for major renovations to provide office space and to provide, the clinic with everything they needed in regards to the physical building itself, including the accessible bathroom. I think this is an ask too much, and I really don't want to start going down this road that we're going to start replacing used equipment. So that's my opinion. So I will not be supporting this.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Noyes. Anyone else? Councillor Dubanow.
Yeah, thank you, Worship. Just touching on that, I'm just wondering, perhaps maybe staff can clarify this. I'm just wondering, was this done in conjunction with the physician recruitment? Like, was there a discussion about, like offsetting the equipment and the clinic relative to bringing this doctor in? Was there any discussion surrounding that? And the reason I ask is I can certainly understand if you have a new doctor set up, they're going to need equipment. The physician recruitment helps with that. But when you look at the actual ask, it's a number of beds. It's a number. Actually, it's 3 scales. It's 3 stools. So I'm wondering, are these going to physicians they're planning on recruiting? Are they going to physicians who are already there? Is it going to the one who is part of the ask right now? That would because I see where Councillor Noyes is coming from. I don't. I agree with her thought process on this. I'm just trying to get some more clarification to find out if there was a thought process to this and how it came about. And I'm just wondering if maybe a member of staff had that info.
Mr. Jansen, would you have any information about this?
Through you, Mayor Redekop, I have limited information. I do know with respect to the nature of the request that, and I couldn't find it right now, but in terms of the incentive guidelines that was approved by council, that equipment such as what is listed, I believe, was one of the components that was eligible. So in that regard, we may want to look at that again. But no, in terms of what you're asking with the nature of the request, I'd have to get back to you on that.
So the policy is very, very brief and very, very vague on equipment. It's like a half a dozen words and with very little other information. So the answer to your questions, Councillor Dubanow, is we don't have that information right now. We could put this over till August the 28th when the CAO is back. He'll be familiar with this and can speak to our coordinator, our health services coordinator, who can give us some background information on that if you are inclined.
Yeah, Your Worship, I actually would like to do that because just looking at for the perspective, if it's for the purpose of recruitment to bring this physician there, that's one thing. I just, to touch on what Councillor Noyes said, outfitting an existing clinic that has existing doctors, I mean, I know healthcare is important. We want to retain the doctors we have, but it's operational versus capital. It's a concern for me. So if we can put this over and get that information, I would feel a lot better making a decision then.
So before we get to that, does there anyone else have any questions or comments on this? Councillor Lewis?
Thank you, Your Worship, and Councillor Noyes and Councillor Dubanow. Thank you.
Oh, what's his name?
Asked the majority of the questions that I was
Okay.
going to ask, but one of the 2 parts that I was struggling with, and I'm just bringing this up as a comment, is under alternatives, it says council could decide not to approve this request. This is not recommended. Enhancements at this location will assist with doctor recruitment. That, I think, speaks to part of what Councillor Dubanow brought up. But it still doesn't necessarily answer the question. And further to Councillor Noyes, the conclusion goes on to say the acceptance of this proposal recommendation will fulfill the goals for enhanced health services planning by this council. And I'm not sure if I maybe don't understand it fully or if I completely agree with that statement. But I too would be supporting, let's put this over and get a little bit more information. It's not a ton of money, but I do agree with the precedent setting. And I know I'm just going to leave comments until we hear.
Yeah, fair enough. And I had a question myself about how this fits into our current initiative to try to ensure that we've got long-term primary, urgent, and secondary healthcare services. And we know without much doubt that we're going to be contributing funding to some type of new facility, which will have equipment. So in that broader context, I was wondering how this might fit. Back to you then, Councillor. Oh, sorry, Councillor Noyes.
Yes, I appreciate everybody's comments on this. And I don't want to detract that we don't want doctors and that we're not supportive of our doctors. I think we've demonstrated that many times over the year. The other thing is that we take $18,000 out of our physician recruitment. That means that there's $18,000 less to attract a doctor and, you know, come up with the $75,000 to $100,000 that may be required. And I honestly don't think any doctor is going to say, well, you didn't pay for my stool, so I'm not coming. You know, and I don't have a new scale, so I'm not coming, or I'm going to leave because you didn't replace my stool or you didn't replace my scale. I'm being a bit facetious here, but but you know, I have more respect for our doctors and the doctors we're going to attract. That this is going to make it or break it. Thank you.
Okay, if there's no one else, back to you, Councillor Dubanow.
Yeah, Your Worship, I'd like to move that we postpone this until our regular council meeting on August 28th, 2023, so that we can get some more information from the CAO.
Okay, that's not debatable. All those in favor? None opposed, so that will go to August the 28th. Any other questions of the items remaining in the consent agenda? Madam Clerk, I would just point out that for the Land Committee minutes, although it said at the beginning of those minutes that I had sent my regrets, I noticed at the end of the meeting that I was commenting on an issue. So maybe I was regretfully there. I don't know. So perhaps you could bring that to the attention of the minute maker. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to call the question on the consent agenda items. All those in favor? None opposed, that's carried. That then takes us to Planning and Development Services, and that's Councillor Dubanow.
Yes, it is, Your Worship. Planning and Development Services is in session. Is in session for the evening. We have no presentations or delegations. We have no reports. Amazingly, there is a item of new business that I wanted to bring up this evening, though, just for council's information. But before I do that, is there any other members of council who have any new business or inquiries they want to bring up this evening? Councillor Noyes.
Thank you, Councillor Dubanow. I want to bring this up now, before our 2024 budget meetings are starting. I'm wondering, and again, I'm thinking it falls under planning development, not infrastructure, is about that, a dog park in Ward 6. And I will say this facetiously, but Councillor Lewis was on council that many years ago when I first brought this issue up in regards to a dog park. There's been a few dog parks done in town, all wonderful, they're great, but none in Black Creek and none in Stevensville. So my question is, can we start with the hopes that we can start doing the planning for a dog park for next year in regards to the feasibility, in regards to location? I know I've asked for at least the last 5 years, but before that, probably 15 years before that, about location. I've even walked around with town staff around Stevensville for possible locations, all for naught. Nothing seems to move forward on this. So what I'm wondering is that can planning and development, if this is where it falls, and I think it does, start looking at the feasibility and the location and things like that, so we do it now, so that when 2024 comes and we start talking about budget, we're not, again, delaying it for a year and a half because we haven't done that type of feasibility study or found a location for it yet. I know I've talked to Sean already about possible locations, but again, we've waited more than 20 years. I think it's time to start moving. I would like to get some of the groundwork done before the budget, because I think that would help us during the budget process.
Yeah, and the very good thing now, Councillor Noyes, is we actually do have a manager of community planning on staff now, so we do have someone to look into this. I'm just wondering, Mr. Hurlovich, is it possible to perhaps have our new manager meet, or perhaps even you or Anamika, whoever staff is best suited for it, perhaps provide an inquiry back to Sorry, like an inquiry, provide a note back to council with some information on whether there is any preliminary planning, whether there's something available, or just to start that process as Councillor Noyes is requesting?
To you, Mr. Chair, yeah, we can take a look into that. She mentioned already working with Mr. Hutton in facilities. I think we need to do a joint facility because it will be a capital expenditure, and so we need to be able to get that information together.
Okay. So, Councillor Noyes, go right ahead.
I do want to qualify that my discussion with Sean was very brief, saying, do you need, because first we were going to put it in the baseball park. That was like the last 10 years. That was a discussion then. Or last 6 years going to be in the baseball park. Now they may need that part for a soccer field. So now you're looking for another spot. And he suggested, so again, the conversation was very, we didn't really sit down and get our heads together. I don't want to put any words in Sean's mouth that we've had a formal meeting by any means.
Thank you, Councillor Noyes. So you'll be able to have staff bring something back, Mr. Hurlovich?
Yes, we'll look into it and report back to council with a memo.
Thank you very much. Anyone else this evening who has any new business or inquiries? Okay, so there's actually a note here on the agenda. I was going to bring up, just for council's information, Lyons Douglas Heights, they did send in a request, and as council may know, some of the new councillors may not, the town has been assisting with some of the fees related to studies and planning process to construct the second seniors building on site there. So there are some additional fees that have come forward. They've made an additional request. So what I'd like to do, and I've spoken to the mayor and some of the staff about this, we're going to work on some wording for a motion. I'm going to bring it forward on the 28th. I'm going to, if council agrees, hopefully we can waive the rules of procedure on that, and then that way we aren't holding them up. It's very difficult right now for service clubs to fundraise, especially post-COVID and the economic situation. It's not a lot of money for the municipality to do, but it means a lot to them. And there may be some more information and some more requests that come forward. So if we get it on the agenda, we get that motion forward, staff can provide some information. So I just wanted to share that. Your worship, yes, please go right ahead.
Yeah, and just for the benefit of the other members of council, part of you giving the heads up now is so that when it comes before us, staff will be able to provide us in advance with information so that we know what we've already agreed to with Douglas Heights, what this current request is and why, and what the long-term assistance that we may be providing them is, so that when we deal with it, at least we'll have that information. Councillor.
Thank you, Your Worship. You actually said that much better than I could have myself. But I do appreciate that. So that was what I was going to bring up this evening. Councillor Noyes.
Thank you. Just because you mentioned affordable housing, it tweaked something like that, I don't know if council is aware of this or not. It was in one of our region information that comes to us often. But because I sit on the affordable housing, and this is important because affordable housing is so important, is that now there is an asset. An individual's assets are now taken into consideration to see if they qualify for affordable housing. Before, you could have $1 million in the bank, and if your income was under whatever the threshold, like 25,000, obviously you didn't invest that million very well, but anyway, is now part of the equation. I think if you're an individual, if you have more than $50,000 worth of assets, you will probably likely not qualify. And if you're a couple, if you have more than $75,000 in assets, you will no longer qualify. And that goes for people who are currently in affordable housing. It's not just the go forward. So we may see some transition. I know for the affordable housing that we sit on, it may affect a number of our residents. In regards to they're not going to be getting the subsidy anymore. Doesn't mean that they have to move out. It just means that they're not going to be getting the subsidy. Thank you.
No, and thank you for that information, Councillor Noyes, because that's been something that you've raised that concern for a number of years, actually, so we appreciate the info. Is there anyone else this evening who has any new business? Your Worship.
Yeah, sorry, Councillor Noyes just reminded me that when we're at AMO next week, one of the region's delegations is to the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, and that will be about affordable housing. They've identified 5 sites in Niagara that they're going to be requesting some assistance with in terms of funding. 2 of the 5 are located in Fort Erie. One of the 2 is Douglas Heights. The other one happens to be the parcel of land that used to be the County Fair Mall, where Gilmore Lodge is being constructed, where Hospice Niagara will be constructed, and they've got some plans for some transitional and affordable housing in there as well. It's like 300, I think they've identified 341 units. Could very well be amenable to more than that, but so that's the region is moving that forward.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. That's actually fantastic news, and I look forward to a positive outcome from that meeting. No one else this evening? All right. Any questions about the business status report? All right. Seeing none, Your Worship, I hand the chair back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Dubanow. Then that takes us to Infrastructure Services, Councillor Noyes.
Thank you, Mayor Redekop. Infrastructure Services is now in session. There are no presentations and delegations. That brings us to report number IS 19-2023, award of tender for Lindbergh Drive and Burbank Terrace. Moved by Your Worship. That report is now on the floor for any comments or questions. Mayor Redekop.
Just to get a little bit of clear understanding, this project has a significant amount of money that is going to be allocated from the stormwater reserve. And my understanding is that there will be a stormwater system that will have piping, but it will also be supplemented with some smaller ditches in the area. Is that correct?
Through you, Madam Chair, that is correct. The reconstruction proposed is what we call a semi-urban reconstruction. Recent examples could be the north portion of Daytona or the south portion of Lakeside. Shallow swales, but a stormwater collection system underneath.
Mayor Redekop.
And I know that Councillor McDermott and I have received a number of communications from residents, some residents, who want to know why they can't have curbs and gutters on their street. Is there an explanation for that other than cost?
Mr. Walsh.
Through you, Madam Chair, other than cost, there is no real explanation right now. Our goal is to bring the existing infrastructure up to a state of good repair. We're simply replacing the existing infrastructure. As the Director of Infrastructure, it's much easier to look after an urban road with curb and gutter, but to add it to this project, we're looking at another $1 million or $1.5 million.
Mayor Redekop.
And that additional cost would also be accompanied, I presume, by some redesigning, which would take time?
Certainly, we could probably add, by the time we re-tender and everything, it's probably another 6 months, so that's pushing us likely into a late spring start rather than a right now start, hopefully with the contractor. And it's, for council's information, through you, Madam Chair, if I may, it's just a matter of it's just not a matter of adding curbs. There is significant excavation that occurs when you have to lower a road to accommodate for the top of the curb.
Mayor Redekop.
And my understanding is that there were opportunities for the public to weigh in on this project through open houses or some type of public information sessions.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Walsh, in regards to the same questions that the mayor was asking, when you're looking at, you said there would be some ditching. What are these ditches? Are they going to be like a gentle ditch, or they're going to be like 0.9 meters deep and 12 feet wide?
Madam Chair, if we're going by the product on Daytona and Lakeside, we're looking at around 2 feet deep, 0.6 meters for our metric friends out there, with a gentle slope on them, easily maintained.
Okay, thank you. Any further comments or questions? Seeing none, all those in favor of the report? The report carries. I never miss an opportunity. That brings us to report number IS 2020-23. Can I have a mover? Thank you, Darren. Councillor Flagg. That report is now on the floor for comments and questions. Councillor Dubanow?
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm going to preface this that I appreciate all of the work staff have done on this, because this has been an issue that has been dragging on for quite a bit of time, particularly the residents on 10th, the challenges that they've had. But I'm a little hesitant to support this, just being because of the complication and the whole matter of the means testing and applying and then the vouchers. It seems overly complicated to me. My preference, and I would certainly hope, is that we have an inventory of our ditches. We know which ones have concerns related to the slope and the depth, that we would know where they are, the difficulty, and then what it would cost to actually engage in a maintenance program, knowing that it would be difficult for residents to. I went through the report, and again, I'm very thankful that staff have ran with this the way they have and addressed councillors' concerns that we've brought up, as best they can. But I would like to know, before I went forward approving something like this, where would our costs be if we just identified a series of ditches that didn't, that met the standard that we have here, outlined in the report, and then we just proceeded to include them as part of our regular routine, street side maintenance. Is it 10,000? Is it 20,000? I'm not saying I'm going to necessarily agree with that, Your Worship, but it would give me a better opportunity to know where we stand on numbers-wise, so that I could sell it as a councillor, because I know right now, I can think of one resident who's going to be very thankful. He'll qualify for this. I can think of several others who are going to say, well, I'm not going to, and they're going to be just as angry about this as they are before. And it puts me into a difficult position, because I have to justify this and sell it to the residents and say, this is the reason why we did this. It's, there's a cost involved. So those are my thoughts. I want to hear from other councillors, if there is any other, members of council who have some thoughts on this. I'm not a member of the infrastructure committee, so perhaps this has been discussed and I'm just not aware, and this is information we have readily available right now. But those are my thoughts, and I hope other members of council weigh in if they have any input or thoughts as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Redekop?
Thank you. I had sent a number of questions to the author of the report to try to get some information, and one of the first questions had to do with the reference to semi-rural and rural, which is the ditches to which this policy would apply, which means they aren't defined. She says that she will define them, but I'm wondering, Madam Chair, if we can get the Director of Infrastructure Services to tell us what semi-rural and rural means. Does it mean anything outside the urban boundary? Does it include anything in the urban boundary?
Mr. Walsh, I think you and I had a discussion on this earlier today.
We did, Madam Chair. So essentially it means, in my previous comments on Lindbergh, I talked about a semi-urban cross-section. I think that can be interchanged with semi-rural. Essentially, it's if you have a ditch in front of your dwelling. The urban areas of town are those with curb and gutter and no ditches.
Well, that would be nice if that's the way it worked, but most of Thunder Bay, which is within the urban boundary, most of Crescent Park, which is within the urban boundary, Lindbergh Drive, which is at the north end, which is within the urban boundary. For heaven's sakes, even Thompson Road, is within the urban boundary now from the river down, so that, Erie Beach, Waverly Beach, those are all within the urban boundary, and they all have, many of them have ditches, very few of them. So I think we need some clarification on that. I think we need to know, does this apply across the town? If it's urbanized and it's got curbs and gutters, well, there are no ditches, except Lindbergh will have a stormwater system. It'll still have ditches. So I think we need to get that clarified. Because there are many places within the urban boundary where we have some pretty impressive ditches. I will use Bernard as an example. Near the trail, you daren't fall in there without some type of flotation device, because it could be challenging to get out. So one of the people that lives immediately south of the trail on Bernard just doesn't clean out his ditches. He can't, for all intents and purposes, and that's something that the municipality should do. On the other side of the first street that runs parallel to the trail, the town has to go out periodically and clean that intersection because the ditch gets so overgrown. So I think it would be helpful if we had a bit of an understanding of what some of these ditches look like in some areas, whether it is realistic for us to expect the residents to clean those out, whether it's got to do with finances, age, ability, whatever. Is that really something that we should be expecting the residents to take care of? A normal ditch, 2.5 feet deep or whatever, with a bit of a grade on either side, that I think should be, and in most cases is. There was one notable exception on Ridge Road going into Ridgeway on the new houses that Len Shishin built years ago on the north side of Dominion Road. One guy insisted that he was going to let his ditch grow, and the town eventually had to periodically cut it. But I think we need to get a handle on that, and I think until we get a handle on that, I'm not sure that I'd want to proceed further to put this policy in place. The other concern that I've got is that there will be some areas where people have culverts, and it may be that they will collapse. It may be that there are people that have recently put in culverts and paid money for them. I don't know how this is going to work when the owner is told, your culvert's coming out, and we're going to replace it with the ditch. That'll be a bit of a challenge, which gets me to my final question is, has there been any public consultation with respect to this? Madam Chair, do we know?
I don't think there has been, but I'll let Mr. Walsh answer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There has not been. Essentially, the only real change to the policy is the addition of our subsidy program. And if I may, Madam Chair, to Councillor Dubanow, I disagree that it's going to be onerous on staff to keep track of, in that we have a similar program with in the winter cleaning windrows, and we have what we have is very successful, but we have very little uptake on it. And I expect similar results to this. Very little uptake, but what we do have will be successful.
Mayor Redekop?
Yeah, I'm willing to hear what others have to say. I would, I think there should be, I know that there's a very small change in this. I'm going to guess that most people don't know what the policy is, and I think it's not so much the policy. I think it's now the intention that the policy will be implemented. And so we may be getting a lot of contact from people. When we have these types of changes, even if it's a change in, okay, now we're going to start to implement this, I think it's good to have for the public to be aware of that. And then at least they can't come back and say to us, I didn't know this was going to happen. How come you didn't consult us? Well, I'm going to listen to what others have to say, Madam Chair. I think this needs a little bit more consideration and maybe some consultation.
Thank you, Mayor Redekop. Any further questions? Councillor Christensen.
can I comment rather than ask a question? It's sort of a question, I guess. I'm not sure. Anyway, I do have similar concerns with respect to definition, depth, the proliferation and location of ditches that are problematic. My other concern, though, and remember, I started my human services career working with income maintenance people, so welfare workers. And I look at this application, and there are a number of issues. One of them is that, and it may relate very much to the low intake, it basically is looking at low-income cutoffs, which are below, most of them are below the poverty line. So there probably are not that many people there, although they may be in financial difficulties as well as having physical difficulties in clearing out ditches. So it may well be that so there's a whole lot of questions from a policy perspective when you get into defining what your maximum incomes are. And I mean, the issue is it becomes the challenge for a municipality whose primary business isn't doing income measurement. So it's something to look at and is a bit of a concern for me, because whether in fact that standard is even valid, particularly given the increasing costs both on property taxes and utilities, all of that. The low-income cutoffs have really not shifted in many, many years. So that whole application is problematic. I don't think it's the primary issue here necessarily, but it hit me where I've worked. And that's a concern. I just wanted to add that as a comment. The work that was done is excellent, but there are a bunch of issues, and we may have created or may be creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of low uptake without addressing true need. So just a comment.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Mayor Redekop, I wanted to turn the chair over when everybody's done.
Yeah, you go ahead, because I'm going to move that we defer this to get some additional information.
I want to make some comments on it, so I'm wondering if Councillor McDermott, actually, Councillor Lewis, you haven't spoken up on it. You're there.
I was going to speak to it, but all the points have already been made, so happy to take the chair. Councillor Noyes, go ahead with your questions.
Yes, one of my concerns was that this was brought up. I'm sure there's probably some residents who have complained that Mr. Smith or Mr. Jones hasn't cut their grass in their ditch and they're doing it. Why isn't Mr. Jones or Mrs. Smith doing it? But I know that this council currently, and the last council brought this up a number of times in regards to the ditch, the size of the ditch itself, and the difficulty in maintaining them. I know I've brought it up a few times. I know Councillor Dubanow has brought it up a few times. I think so this is not just a residents' complaint-driven request for report. I think it was a council for some of the concerns that we brought up. Not all ditches are created equal. I think you can go around town and you can see all ditches are all different sizes and shapes, which they have to be. And I think the mayor commented about the urban areas. I think urban areas, I have urban areas in my ward that have really deep ditches that they cannot maintain, but this policy wouldn't apply to it because they're not in the rural or semi-rural area. I think it's a good thing that we have the 0.9. At least we're starting to set some criteria in regards to which ditches would apply. But if you look at the example, the 0.9 would mean that it's a 0.9 high, which is about 3 feet high. It would require the ditch itself to be 14 feet wide, because it's 2 meters to everything. So it would be a 14-foot ditch. I don't think we have any of them in town. Perhaps there's one in front of Value. I don't know where we have a 14-foot wide ditch that's 3 feet long. I don't know if they even exist. I do not think income should be a part of the equation. And I can give some examples on a regional level, and I can give you more examples on a provincial level. But for instance, the garbage tanks, if you have someone in your home that requires, incontinence supplies or medical supplies, et cetera, they're not asked how much money you make, and granted, we're thinking they're $1.85 or $2.85 for the tag, but they're not asking you afford this. They're asked, okay, there's a doctor's note that you have medical supplies and you need the need for an extra garbage tag, and you can get, I think you're sent 6, and they can ask for more if you need more. The same thing if you're unable, because of a physical disability, to bring your garbage to the curb, you can be registered to get the garbage picked up at your door. Outside the garage, that you don't have to bring it. Again, I don't think it's income-based at all, and I don't think it should be. Asking the residents to maintain town property, we need to ensure that they can do it safely. And I think that's always been my thing. I know that there's some ditches that if I was to maintain, I would have to take a ladder to go down and to climb up. They're so deep. And I have a few in my ward that I will say that the residents' neighbors are helping them out. And they don't want the 70-year-old person trying to go down into the ditch. And they're saying, we'll do it. But then the resident feels bad because he's maintained it for probably about 45 years. He's maintained it. The town has come in and fixed it because of the new development that's south of it. And there's more outflow, there's more water in that because that's all urbanized. So he's the first house, I think, in the old development backing onto the new development. So now his ditch is much deeper, much wider. He can no longer maintain it. And there's another one on Black Creek Road. It's come up a number of times. Again, we fixed it. So he can no longer maintain it, even though he has done it for decades. So my two concerns are, should it be income-based? And I do not think it should be. It's town property. And the other thought is in regards to the criteria. We don't have, maybe I'm wrong, maybe we do, 0.9, 14 foot, 3 foot. I don't know any. I know that some may be higher but not as wide. Maybe they wouldn't match the criteria. And I think that the criteria is the deciding factor, that it has to be at least 0.9, at least 3 feet deep. But there are some that I've seen that are maybe not quite 3 feet deep, but it's straight up and down. There's no 2-to-1 ratio. So I think we do need to look at it. I do think it's a good starting point, but I definitely think it is a good starting point. And someone mentioned, did we bring this up at Infrastructure Services? I have, and I made my concerns known then, that I thought that the council may have some problems with that approach. But the other thing is, Mr. Walsh, you mentioned that we have a policy in place now, but are we referring then to the boulevard policy? That you have to maintain your boulevard, which includes the ditches? Is that the policy that's already in existence that you were referring to, or is there another policy that specifically addresses ditches?
Mr. Walsh?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have a policy that addresses ditch alterations already. It's primarily aimed at ditch infills, which goes to the mayor's comments about removing culverts. It's been in place since long before I got here. And we use it when we need to. For instance, on Lindbergh, there are a number of houses that have filled in their ditches recently that were unknown to town staff. If they had have come in and applied for a ditch infill, it would have been denied. So when we reconstruct, we will be removing those infills, for instance.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Councillor Noyes?
Yeah, and I thank you for that, because I'm not talking about the ditch infills. I know that's an issue that has to be dealt with, absolutely. But I'm talking about existing ditches that are not infill situations that have now, are posing, I would think, a safety issue to the residents who are trying to maintain them. Thank you.
I know, Your Worship, you had a comment, but are there any other councillors who haven't spoke to it that wish? Seeing none, back to you, Your Worship. I know you had some comments.
Yeah, I'm just going to move that we defer this, but I wanted to say that I think it's important that we have a policy. I think that's extremely important, and staff has a big challenge. We all receive complaints about drainage all the time, continuously, but I do think that we need to make sure that we understand this and that the public understands what it is we're going to be doing. So I would suggest that we defer this to the next council and committee meeting, and it could be further deferred if necessary, so that staff can provide us with this information. Number one, a clear definition of rural and semi-rural. Number two, an inventory of the ditches not reasonably maintainable by residents. Number three, that would be within that rural and semi-rural area. Number three, what the cost would be to the town of periodically maintaining those ditches. Number four, a consideration of whether there should be a change in the criteria for an assistance program rather than financial based, and some recommendations as to the extent of public consultation there should be on this. Those are the items. There may be other items that other members of council think should go in there. I'm quite happy to have them pipe up now, but I would move that we defer this to the next council and committee meeting.
So we have a motion on the floor to defer to the August 28th council meeting. Are there
No, to the September 2nd council and committee meeting. I've got the second. Is there a council meeting on the second?
Madam Clerk?
No. Actually, it could be the 16th. I think it's oh, sorry.
Madam Clerk, can you confirm?
Do I have the right year? Yes.
Next meeting of council?
September. It is September the 11th.
Because everyone's talking.
Councillor Lewis, Mr. Walsh wanted to weigh in.
Mr. Walsh?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I may comment on the timing.
Yep.
What the mayor has asked for in particular, the cataloging of ditches that don't meet this criteria is quite an undertaking, given we're, believe it or not, in the middle of summer, but nearing the end of summer. I simply don't have the staff to do this. That would take, I'll say, a few months.
Your worship?
On top of our existing duties.
Well, then let's aspirationally look to October the 16th, and if there's still time needed, that's fine. My only concern would be, we do have an existing policy that staff can still utilize, is that correct?
Mr. Walsh?
That is correct.
Yeah, okay, so let's use October the 16th as an aspirational date, and if more time is required, then so be it. We can further adjourn it.
So we have a motion on the floor to defer until October 16th. Is there anyone else that wishes to add to the motion to defer as the mayor has offered? None. All those in favor of the motion to defer? And that carried. Now back to you, Councillor Noyes, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Lewis, for doing such a great job. That brings us to new business inquiries. Any new business inquiries? Seeing none, that brings us to the business status report. Seeing none, infrastructure services is now closed.
Wait a second. So the first item on the business status report is the closing triangle roads bylaw. It has August the 26th, but I think that should be the 28th, should it not?
I'm sorry, is the 28th the Monday? Today's the 14th, right? Yeah, I'm
28th.
I'm not coming in on the Saturday, so yes.
Okay, so we'll do it the 28th?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not
Thank
here
you.
on the Saturday.
Thank you.
Okay. Who knows? Anyway, okay, any further questions on the business status report? We've now corrected that date. Infrastructure services is now closed, and I turn the chair back.
Thank you very much, Councillor Noyes. That takes us to corporate services. Councillor McDermott.
Thank you, Worship. We have no presentations this evening. We have no reports. We do have any new business inquiries?
Oh, we have one.
Okay.
Yeah, new business inquiries. We have an item, so I'll move that.
Okay, thank you. So it's the Property Standards Committee recommendation that council increases the composition of the Property Standards Committee to 6, and further that council directs staff to revise bylaw 71, 2023. Any comments or questions? Seeing none, all in favor? Carried. Does anybody have anything for the business status report? That's all I have right now, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor McDermott. I know you were trying to drag that out a little bit, but no luck. So that takes us to the next item, which is closed session. You recall that in July the 23rd, we gave direction to staff. Staff has brought forward some of that direction, which was to increase the size of the Property Standards Committee. Is there any need for us to go into closed session? Because the fulfillment of the filling of the vacancy that had been created, plus the new vacancy, will be dealt with in the ordinary course on August the 28th by a resolution of council. So is there any need for us to go into closed session? If there is anybody that thinks there is, raise your hand and we'll vote you down. No. Okay, that then takes us to scheduling of meetings. And are there any meetings that anyone wishes to alert us to? Councillor McDermott.
Your Worship, I just want to mention one meeting that we're having at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning at RIA, where Minister Dunlop, the Minister for Colleges and Universities, will be there to celebrate something that we both have been working on for some time to come, and that's the TRACE program of the Sheridan College coming to Fort Erie.
Correct. That's at 9 o'clock. I think that may be an invitation-only event, as far as I'm aware. Any other meetings that anyone wishes to alert us to? Councillor Noyes.
Thank you, Mayor Redekop. There's a Fort Erie non-for-profit housing meeting this Wednesday, the 16th at 9 o'clock at Betty's.
Yeah. Not a bad idea. And of course, I'd already announced that we're going to be at AMO next week. Okay. If there are no other meetings that anyone wishes to announce, Councillor Dubanow, how about if you bring this to a conclusion?
Yes, Your Worship, I'd like to move that council and committee adjourn this evening at 7:37 p.m.
All those in favor? That is unanimous.